All right, those of you just joining us, just about 30 more seconds. We're just waiting for a few more folks to get in and get settled, and we'll get going. So about 30 seconds, we'll start the webinar. All right, I think we're good. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us in the second of our Industrial Insights webinar series. If you were with us for the first series, we talked a little more about cost and availability of materials, procurement issues, supply chain issues, that sort of thing. Today we're going to switch gears a little bit and go more into site selection. If you notice the title, Keep Calm, Embrace the Chaos, if you've been involved in a site selection process over the past 18, 24 months, that's probably a phrase you can appreciate and relate to. But what we want to do today is bring together a panel of experts, I might even say legends, that can talk to almost every aspect, every facet of the site selection process. And so over the next hour, we're going to be providing you lots of information, lots of insight, kind of telling you what we know to make your lives easier when it comes to site selection. As always, the chat box is open. Feel free to jump in. I'll be monitoring that throughout our discussion. Any questions you have are absolutely important, and we want to address those. So don't hesitate to jump in with questions at any time, and we'll get to those. But without further ado, I want to start by introducing Dee Dee Caldwell. Probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do it anyways. But Dee Dee is the president and founder of Global Location Strategies, GLS. She's, like I said, a legend in the industry. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the name if you haven't worked with her directly. She's going to start off giving us just a few minutes overview of what she's seeing in the marketplace and some of the strategies she's used to be successful. And then we'll have the other panelists join us for more of a roundtable discussion and take your questions as well. So without further ado, Dee Dee, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you today. I am going to kick it off. I'm just going to do about 10 or 15 minutes talking a little bit about the site selection process and where we are in terms of the economy and what's happening these days. Just a little bit about GLS. We're based in Greenville, South Carolina, and we're a purpose-driven organization. So our purpose is to match companies and communities for mutual sustainable prosperity. So mutual prosperity, sustainable prosperity, those are all things that are really important to the companies that we serve and also the communities where we locate those companies. So I always like to start out with what our main purpose is. So I thought it would be a good idea for us to just step back a little bit before we start talking about the site selection process is to, I'm going to start my timer here too, I forgot to do that. Is to take a look at, what are some of these macroeconomic impacts on foreign direct investment, or really just investment in general. And all of these were in place before COVID-19 actually hit, except for obviously COVID-19, but they're things that are changing the entire landscape of where companies are putting their, putting capital expenditures, putting jobs, putting technology. And some of those are the shifting energy landscape. So the U.S. has gone from a net energy exporter to a net importer to a net energy exporter, primarily due to the shale fracking and the plentiful oil and gas that has come from that. It makes us one of the most competitive locations in the world to put capital in energy intensive projects. Demographic pressures. So much of the developed world and emerging countries like China are suffering from a kind of an unhealthy population pyramid. So if you think about China, they went with the one-child policy from four grandparents to 2 parents to 1 child. That has put a lot of pressure on their economy because they're aging into mass retirement. But it's not just China, it's Russia, it's Germany, it's Italy, it's Japan, it's Korea. Fortunately, the US has, the baby boomers did one thing really well, and that was have kids. And so thanks to the eco boom and also to immigration, we have a relatively healthy population pyramid. And we have a neighbor to the south that has a very healthy population pyramid, Mexico, which can serve as a low cost of labor and also a consumer market for US goods. Climate change is definitely driving decisions, making them change, both because we're seeing projects that are helping address climate change. They're just more environmentally conscious products and the methods of production, but also looking at where companies are going to locate. So things like weather risk have become a lot more important. So when you think about droughts, you think about floods, you think about tornadoes, you think about hurricanes. These have always been a part of the site selection process, but they're growing in importance as those 100 and 1,000-year events become more and more common. Of course, we've got trade and tariff uncertainty. That has calmed down a little bit. We were able to successfully renegotiate NAFTA, so we have the USMCA, but we still have trade and tariff uncertainty when we're talking about Asia and certainly with China. A lot of the tariffs that were implemented during the Trump administration are still around, and we don't expect those to go away anytime soon. And so that is making imported goods from China less competitive. And the threat of conflict. So this is one that usually people are like, huh? You know, it's been a long time since we've had any kind of large scale war. And I'm not talking about the Middle East. That's definitely something we've been engaged in, but I'm talking about that the types of conflict that can really disrupt supply chains. And, but we see that with China being more and more aggressive with Taiwan, obviously Saudi Arabia and Iran are, you know, not very friendly. These are things that we have to watch. And then ultimately COVID-19 was like the ultimate disruptor. So all of this was coming to a head already in 2020, and then you had COVID-19 hit. And what that really led to was a major decline in global cross-border investment. So this is from FDI, Financial Times, FDI Markets. And this is really looking at cross-border investment. So it's foreign direct investment plus investments in the United States that happen across state borders. So you can see that we reached a peak sort of 2018, 2019. The peak for jobs and CapEx was in 2018. Really steep drop off in 2020, which is probably not that surprising, but we're still pretty weak in 2021. Now, obviously this is only through August, so we'll probably get to where we were in 2020, but this is the global data. If we break that down and separate the different countries, then we can see the US is up here. Now, don't pay that much attention to the relative difference between the US and all of these other countries, because this includes investment in the United States that is across state borders. So it's a little bit not an apples to apples comparison, but I think what we want to pay attention to is the trend and how this line compares to all of these others here. And to make it a little bit easier for you, I'm going to look at, here we can see what the market share. So this is totals and this is market share. So even though we had a decline in projects in 2020, the market share of the US went up significantly. And that's by total projects. But if we look at total CapEx by year, we actually went up slightly in 2020, and 2019 was also up for 2018. China, you can see they reached a peak at 2018 and then have fallen off significantly. And the market share for the US is over 30% at this point. Even when we look at jobs, so we think about jobs typically leaving the US and going overseas, you can see that really starting in about 2009, there was a divergence. So the US has become stronger and stronger over the last 10 years or so when it comes to attracting jobs, and particularly in 2020, when it was difficult to do projects in other places around the world, the US was very, very strong. So what does all this mean? Well, if you're an economic developer, it means that you just need to keep calm and embrace the chaos. If you're a corporate location decision maker, recognizing these major shifts that are impacting the supply chain and being able to react to them is something that you definitely want to do. And it seems a little bit chaotic right now, but I would posit that, keep calm, embrace the chaos, make decisions based on the fundamentals like you always have, but you definitely need to keep your eye on what's happening in the future because things are changing very rapidly. So break it down to, if you're a corporate location decision maker, what are the keys to success for choosing an optimal site location? So one of them is that you just need to start early. We get a lot of calls from companies that say, yeah, I need a site in 4 weeks. I actually just got off the phone with a company that's doing a project in Europe. It's $1 billion project, and they want us to do an analysis in 3 weeks, to which we kindly no bid. I mean, it's just not possible for us to do any justice to the project in 3 weeks. If we look at a traditional site selection project, it's going to take about 4 to 6 months, just depending on what you've done already, to get to your finalist sites. And then once you get to those finalist sites, you're going to spend some period of time, typically we say 8 to 12 weeks, in incentive negotiations and due diligence. But the reality is, depending on how complex your project is, depending on what are the drivers and how complex the incentives are, it could take 8 to 12 weeks. So, or even longer. So one of the things that we are dealing with, we just had an announcement in just outside of Waco, Texas, and just getting through the Chapter 313 process, the Texas Enterprise Fund was very complicated in terms of the infrastructure. I mean, we've really been working on incentive negotiations for more than 3 months, and they were just able to announce. And we've been working on that project since 2018. So starting early is definitely a key to success. These are hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars in investment, and taking that extra time can save you a tremendous amount of money on the back end. The second thing is that you want to follow an orderly process. So the way we like to do it is to really cast a really wide net and put as many alternatives that you think would work into the top end of the funnel, because it's always easier to eliminate locations than it is to be too restrictive early in the process and have to go back and gather information about more locations because you didn't come up with something that was feasible. And then you're able to eliminate and refine those screens until you finally get down to a smaller number, so that you can get into greater and greater granular detail as you move through the process. We typically look at about 850 data points from start to finish that range anywhere from cost and building characteristics, utilities, environmental, et cetera. There's just so many things that you have to drill down on. So you want to make sure that you have a way to collect that information and analyze it through a process. When we're working with clients, we're really helping them balance quality, cost, and risk. So all things being equal, you'd like to have a location that is highest quality, lowest cost, and the least risk. And these are all location dependent items. And the way we represent that is putting this on a 2x2. This is actually low to high, I should say high to low here. But what we're looking for is things that are in this top right-hand quadrant. So these locations have a good combination of very high quality scores. So things like labor availability and quality, good site characteristics, ease of environmental permitting, et cetera. And they also have low operating costs. This one has less, or actually has more location specific risk than this one. That's represented by the size of the bubble. So once you get down to this short list, then you can really start looking at ways to increase the quality, mitigate the risk, lower the cost through either due diligence or incentive negotiations, and then help understand whether or not those risks that remain are ones that you're willing to take. The other thing that you want to do is really dedicate the resources to doing it right. So at GLS, we have a whole suite of technology products that we bring to bear. And we've actually created a curated marketplace for corporate decision makers called Site Selection Tech. It's at siteselectiontech.com. And it is a function of several different software, including Lasso, Site Shepherd, and Stage 1, so that you can, as a corporate decision maker, can actually use the tools of the pros if you'd like to do it yourself, and work through that process to help drive you to the optimal location. You also want to dedicate the right people resources to that. So a location decision is not just the job of the supply chain expert or of the finance person or the salesperson. You really need to bring in stakeholders from all across the company to make sure that you are taking into consideration what would make a successful project with them. And then obviously you want to know when to call in the experts. So cultivating partnerships with site selectors, with logistics providers, engineering and construction, permitting, public advocacy. Most times, unless you're an Amazon or somebody that's doing multiple projects on an annual basis, you don't have all of this talent in-house. And so you can try to give it to somebody else that has a day job or maybe doesn't have that expertise, or you can bring in outside experts. Normally, the return on investment is going to be much higher if you bring in people that do this type of work day in and day out. The last key is really maintaining objectivity. I have had a lot of clients that have come to me and have started their process and they've narrowed it down to a location. It's like, well, sometimes they're egregious. It's like, well, where can I park my boat? Sometimes it's a little more subtle. It's like, you know, well, somebody told me that this was a good location, or I've seen the marketing ad. So you really want to try to take out the subjectivity that is subject to is often common in a lot of these decisions. And then ultimately, if you're able to do that, then you can have a successful project. This is just one that I've worked on in the past. This is J.D. Irving Consumer Products, a Canadian company that announced in Macon, Georgia. And when you think about these decisions, they're really multi-generational. And I think the Irvings are a great example of how they really are stewards of generational growth. We announced in 2017 a tissue machine in Macon, Georgia, and then when they had the grand opening that same day, they announced another tissue machine in 2019. So this is an example of where they were able to drive to the optimal location such that it was so successful that they were willing to double their investment there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and we can open it up to the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me quickly, first of all, thank you, Dee Dee, so much. And a couple of questions came to mind, but let me introduce our panelists real quick before I do that. So returning by popular demand, David Wright, principal of Bennett & Pless, structural engineer located in Nashville. You guys all remember him. And joining us for the first time, Brian Farlow from Terracon, business development manager, but also background as an economic development professional. You were on the municipality side for a while. And then also, last and certainly not least, my good friend Tim Smith from J.E. Dunn Construction. Tim serves as a business development manager for J.E. Dunn, but has a wide background, both engineering, design, build, and construction of industrial facilities all over the place. So just a wealth of knowledge here. So Dee Dee, I want to go back real quick to something you said. You showed the chart that had the cross-border investment statistics, and then the top line was the U.S. You were saying that was interstate investment in the country, right? So in the current,
it's both foreign direct investment and interstate, yes.
Okay. So, okay, perfect. So the question that comes to mind is, just from what you're seeing, are there clear winners or maybe gainers or losers among the states as far as that investment? Are there some that are definitely prospering and some that are maybe faltering?
Well, it depends on the type of projects. I mean, obviously manufacturing has been very prominent in the Southeast and generally in the Sun Belt. So Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, you think about those states, they've been very, very successful. North Carolina, I think, has the highest win rate when it comes to just pure manufacturing projects since about 2016. So you see states that have low cost of electricity, that have reasonable costs for labor, and also have business regulations that are friendly to their environment. I think the losers here are clearly California, Washington. I just did a speech last week for Washington where we looked at, they're 9th in the nation in population. They're 13th in total projects, and they're lower than 20th in manufacturing projects, even though manufacturing projects is the #1 contributor to their CapEx and jobs.
Wow.
But that tells me there's a lot of interstate activity that's happening there. So Amazon's expanding, Microsoft is expanding, but they're not doing a very good job in recruiting projects to their location. And I think a lot of that has to do with availability of sites. Washington has very competitive electricity prices, so it's not that, but they don't have good available sites. And they also don't have business regulations that are very friendly to manufacturers.
Gotcha. Great. Just for reference, I did put the site selection tech link in the chat box. If anybody wants to check that out, that's the site that Dee Dee referenced as she was talking. So let's switch gears a little bit, Brian. So Dee Dee said something I'm sure you'd agree with, the importance of starting early, right? There's no question. You really can't start too early. But what if I've missed the boat on that? I'm a corporate location decision maker, and I haven't given it that at least 4 to 6 months lead time. Maybe I've got 2 months. What are some ways I can expedite or shortcut the process and still have confidence in the ultimate site selection?
One of the things I would just always recommend is, even if you haven't started with a professional site selection consultant or some kind of technical expert, it's never too late to reach out. Timelines can be accelerated. Sometimes it just costs more or things of that nature. But if you try to do it yourself and you're a little behind the 8 ball, or you think you're missing something, definitely reach out to someone like Dee. And if you're looking at greenfield sites or even building searches, reach out to folks like David and me, because we all have systems that we can get you back on track pretty quick. So you're never too late to get back on the due diligence train. Unless it's only 3 weeks and you want to build in Europe. That's the exception.
We are site selection consultants and technical experts, but we're not miracle workers.
Not miracle workers. Okay, we're not quite there yet. Between that and David's steel stretcher, I think we've got a market we could capitalize on.
Working on it.
Okay. So you mentioned 850 data points. That was actually a shocking number to me, Dee, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are the ones that we miss the most as owners, developers? What are the ones that we just absolutely overlook, but they're critical?
I think it really depends on who is who's responsible for driving the site selection project. So if it's a construction guy, he's really focused on the land and what it's going to cost to develop and get the infrastructure there. And one of the things I tell my clients is that you build it once, you operate it forever. So even if it costs you a little bit more or takes a little bit longer, or it's just a little bit more challenging, I think there's too much emphasis that's put on that front end development versus what it's going to be like to operate there in the future. And one of the things that is, I don't think it's necessarily missed, it's just hard to understand, is labor quality and availability. Because when I started doing this 23 years ago, understanding whether or not you had a labor force that could meet the requirements was not as complicated as it is now. If you're hiring 200 or more people, I can tell you which places you're more likely to be successful, but I can't guarantee you that you're going to be successful. It's like you have to choose the least bad at this point, because we're all struggling to get the labor that we need.
Sure, absolutely. And I know a lot of times, especially early in the process, like you're talking, there's not a lot of detail, or at least there's not a lot of detail known or shared in terms of the client, the type of facility, and all that. So Tim, kind of thinking about it from almost the end of the process perspective, you get brought into this. You may not know who the client is. You may not know exactly what the function of the building is going to be. Do you, in order to kind of give the input and advice that you do you kind of create a dummy persona of who that client is? Do you kind of rely on a kind of a hypothetical client to determine all the right metrics and numbers and costs and all that? Or are you just kind of left hamstrung and only able to give part of the answer until you know more?
I think it's the latter, Matt. I mean, obviously, the sooner we can be engaged, and we like to be involved as a design build partner very early in the process. And that's when projects really are successful. You build the relationships, there's a lot of collaboration. And we like to challenge things that we do hear from that client. We had a recent project where a client had hired their own civil firm. And, for example, there was going to be a lot of dirt to move anyway. It's a 40-foot elevation change. They wanted a flat site. And they said there was no rock found, but there was actually a lot of rock 20 feet down. And there was a couple $1 million in blasting, and thousands of tons of rock was taken out, and it caused project delays. So that's where we would like to challenge that, bring in a Terracon or someone that we trust, and make that a successful project. And like Dee said, you can't start early enough in that regard.
So in a case like that, you don't need all the details. You need a basic footprint, you need a basic building size, that kind of thing. But I mean, you don't need to know necessarily what the use of the building is or who the client is, right? You can.
We certainly like to, and I think there's a lot of other things that brings. And we're talking greenfield sites here, but Dave and I have talked a lot too about adaptive reuse of existing buildings. And again, is the structure adequate for the size bridge cranes that we're going to need? We have to take out some flooring and put in bigger foundations. But yeah, it certainly helps us to know. And there's other aspects about the company culture when it comes to the ingress and egress and other ancillary facilities they want on that site. So again, the more we know, the earlier, the better.
The more you know, the better. But then conversely, Dee Dee, if I'm going back to your world, you're working with clients in the early stages, they don't want a lot known typically. How do you work around that? How do you make sure you're getting all the answers you need and still maintaining that confidentiality?
Sure. So typically speaking, our clients are very upfront and transparent with us as someone that's under confidentiality, and also with their design build firm. Because the more we know and can understand about their process, the better we're going to be in translating that into location requirements. But when we reach out to states and communities and start identifying sites and buildings for them, we want to be as transparent as we possibly can about what are the inputs and what are the outputs, even if it's not a final product, but looking at, the flow of raw materials and finished goods and how they're coming in, how they're coming out, what kind of utilities they need. It's kind of like, I don't, even as a site selection consultant, it's not that important really what happens inside the box. It's really more about what happens around it and what type of employment you need.
Gotcha.
And I think that's also true from the community standpoint, that there's so many reasons not to divulge exactly who the company is and exactly what they're going to be producing. Competitive issues, labor management relations, just trying to control the message. When it comes to the appropriate time, we will definitely disclose that information, but we want to give as much information to the communities as we can in order to be able for them to assess whether or not this is a good fit for them, but then also for us to be able to determine if it's a good fit for the company as well.
Sure. Absolutely. Let's switch gears a little bit. Tim made a great point. We're talking kind of greenfield here, but I know adaptive reuse has become a hot topic as the availability of kind of ideal greenfield sites may not be as readily available. So, David, let me take it to you. You find a building that may or may not work, and again, you're kind of without maybe all the details early on. What are the things you're looking for to determine suitability really early on in that process?
Well, of course, adaptive reuse is a very popular technique, especially like in what I would call county seat towns, maybe not the municipalities, but the little bit more rural areas who had a large plant and then for whatever reason lost that plant, and the ability to go in and perform an adaptive reuse on that can help resurrect that town and the local economic community. So it can be a very important aspect. And, we naturally have done that a number of times. People in this business are asked to do that quite often. And, many of the things that Dee Dee and Brian were talking about are still paramount in that decision. But at the end of but one of the decisions have to be made is the physics question. Mm-hmm. Can that building be adapted, modified in order to accommodate whatever the future use is? Mm-hmm. And we have seen some pretty unusual and creative adaptations. Buildings that started out as a warehouse being made into a metal stamping plant. And one of the advantages was that there was a railroad spur that happened to run through the building, which was quite unusual. Mm-hmm. So, all those things have to be taken into play. We, the ability to come in and that is one of the things I would just add is knowing what that reuse is planned to be. Allows us to evaluate the loading criteria and what we can and cannot do to the building in order to make it work. Mm-hmm. But if you've already owned the land and you've already paid the incentives and you've already done all those things, if you can take one of those buildings and do an adaptive reuse, it can be a win-win situation.
Do you ever run into situations where the building itself, the structure isn't suitable, but maybe the foundation and the infrastructure is all there, and it still makes sense just to raise what's there and build on the existing foundation?
Sure. And there are ways that you can isolate maybe the heavy load demand. Let's say that you've got, Tim and I were talking about, you have an adaptive reuse where all of a sudden you've got to introduce the use of cranes. Mm-hmm. Well, by working with the owner and their actual process layout and what they need to do, you might be able to isolate that, that higher demand to a smaller area, spend the money to update that, but the rest of the building is less expensive to make that adaptation. So I would say in that case, it does help a lot to understand the communication. But again, you're dealing with an existing building, which is a lot of motivation on the local level to get that plant back into use.
Sure, absolutely. That makes sense.
And Matt, I have a comment on that. So at GLS, we have a process called reverse site selection, where we take some of those strategic assets, which could be, an example might be a closing coal-fired power plant, and reversing the site selection process to see what processes would be suitable at that location. Right. We didn't do a reverse site selection on this, but there was an old Miller Coors brewery in Eden, North Carolina, that we did a site readiness assessment on. And we went in there, we were looking at all of the equipment and talking to them about what it could be reused for. And just a few months later, Purina went in and purchased that building, and it's a new for dog food manufacturing. The interesting thing, clients are interested in this for a variety of reasons. Number one, it can speed things up, because if they don't have to permit and build and engineer and construct, their rail sidings and their substations and their wastewater treatment facilities, et cetera, it can save them a lot of time. It can save them a lot of money. But there's another component to that, which is the environmental piece of it. And that is, as long as they can get a clean bill of health through some sort of voluntary cleanup contract or something like that, it's actually much more environmentally friendly to redevelop an existing industrial facility than to go to a greenfield site. Sure. And more of our clients are focused on these ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance. So that's one of the things that makes a brownfield really attractive.
Makes total sense.
Yeah, and Dee brings up a great point. There's some states right now, Matt, where there's extensive delays on bringing power to a site. And Dee mentioned Nestle in North Carolina. Some of us were involved at a project in Georgia that they did. It was a 1.2 million square foot former textile mill, but it had the power, the gas, the water, and it's now a modern, pet food plant. But I think the key thing is, the utilities are, one key thing is there's some very extensive delays right now in getting those to a site because of COVID and some other issues in the supply chain and labor.
So you're flipping the script, right? Now you're kind of talking about a site looking for an owner versus an owner looking for a site. So how do you market that? Are you doing that analysis, Dee, for a specific client in mind, or are you doing it generally and then shopping it out to the site selection market?
We're usually doing it either for the owner of the property, for the economic development organization that represents that property, or for a utility. So we've done lots of coal-fired power plant analysis for Entergy. We have done Martinsville, Virginia. It wasn't a there was a brownfield facility that was an old DuPont facility, and then also for their industrial park, we did reverse site selection for them as well.
So if I'm a decision maker for corporate location, how do I find out about those sites that have already been kind of reverse selected like that?
The way that you find out about all the other sites, certainly
dumb luck, is that what I'm hearing?
States and communities are marketing their sites.
Right.
I'd love to see kind of a national database, which is actually something that the Site Selectors Guild that we're talking about, developing a national database that's searchable. There's lots of databases out there that you can poke around on. My frustration with those is that they're not, sometimes they're inaccurate, they're not exhaustive. So there might be sites and buildings out there that aren't listed there, and they just don't have the type of information that I need. So it might tell you how big the site is or what the clear height is in the building, but when it comes to water and wastewater, it just says, yes, it has it, which is not really enough for me to evaluate whether or not that's a good fit for my clients.
Sure, absolutely. How reliable, and Brian, I'll take this to you, because since you kind of lived in that world, but how reliable is that data? Dee's talking about 850 different data points. I'm sure those come from a variety of different sources. How much of that is reliable? How much of it is lagging or historic data that maybe isn't current? What's your perception?
So a lot of the databases that are out there right now for site certificate or site searches and things like that, a lot of them is dependent on the inputs from the community itself. because it's really hard to have a all-encompassing database with everything that we look at for site selection purposes. And it's a lot, and if it's up to the local community to keep their information updated, I mean, it's a lot easier to say, yeah, we got water here versus, all right, we've got a $5 million tank, we've got 2 million excess left, or, you know, we've got 25 megawatt substation with 0.5 megawatts left over. So that information almost normally has to come directly from the locals during the RFI process, because it's hard to, unless it's input individually, that is hard to track and it's hard to maintain and update.
Sure.
And then, like,
I guess, would a fair assumption be that a smaller municipality or a more remote area probably not have the current accurate data that a larger municipality could, just because it takes manpower to input the data, right?
It's manpower, funding for the type of software. Now there are a lot of regional organizations, a lot of utility groups have these where they have, you know, regional economic developers that will help some of these rural communities do it. But even then, sometimes if you don't have a professional EDO in your community, you miss a lot of the data points that a lot of site selection consultants look for, because you haven't run enough projects, you haven't experienced enough site visits, you don't exactly know what to look for. That's where some of these other regional organizations, TVA comes to mind as far as one that's really good about helping the rural communities. But even then, a lot of times it's up to that either local mayor or whoever it may be to pull that information to give to TVA for that kind of assistance. There's ways to do it if you're a rural community, and it's definitely using the resources that are available to you.
Sure.
A lot of them are already paid for by federal grants, state grants, or just the way the utility districts are set up themselves. There's ways to do it.
Gotcha. How much of the, oh, go ahead, Didi, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, I think it really depends on the sophistication of the community and their ability to put funds toward it. So I talked about Martinsville before. They have a foundation that was established when they sold a not-for-profit hospital in their community, and they established a foundation which they direct towards economic development. So they have a professional economic development staff. They have spent lots of money on developing product. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a ready site or building, you're not going to be successful in attracting a project. And it's hard. I mean, developing product takes time, it takes commitment, it takes vision. You got to work the politics. And so those communities, and let me tell you, those sites are being snapped up like that. I mean, we have projects internal to global location strategies that are vying for the same site.
Wow.
In that particular region, it's the only site that's worth a darn. So I often say, you know, economic development is a marathon, it's not a sprint, but I've revised that and now it's a 10K.
Where you sprint that last few hundred meters.
It's a 10K. I mean, there is just so much. I've been doing this nearly quarter of a century. I have never seen this level of activity coming into the US. So if you're not being successful right now in economic development, it's because you need to take a really hard look at your value proposition and figure out where you're missing out.
Sure.
Because I think that there is a project out there for almost every community. You just have to be ready for it.
That's fantastic. So you guys, you know, make a great case, and it makes me wonder what would prevent somebody who's going through this, you know, corporate location or site selection process. What would prevent them from bringing on experts early? Do they just not know? Do they think they can do it themselves up to a certain point? What's the hesitation to make that phone call early on?
Personally, I think a lot of it is they think they have a team, they know what their processes are, and a lot of them know generally where they want to look to begin with. They've already done the logistics surveys of raw material and finished goods out, so they have a general idea where to go. And site selection as a whole doesn't seem that complicated, and I don't think it is that complicated, but you need to know what to ask and in what order. And that's typically where I see direct company site selection projects flounder is they'll either start with incentives or they'll start with the tax code for, you know, 100 different sites and just get bogged down in something that needs to be closer to the end. Because if you don't have a viable site or a building, you know, digging into the tax code and what the incentives are is it bogs you down and takes up a lot of time.
Sure.
It's not complicated, but it's complex.
Exactly.
Now, I say that I'm an inch deep and a mile wide as a site selection consultant. And if somebody says, I don't give myself enough credit, I say, okay, I'm an inch deep and 2 miles wide. Because knowing a little bit about so many different things that can have a serious impact on your ability to be successful at that location. And if you miss any one of those, then you could find yourself in a world of hurt. So like Brian said, it's not complicated. This is not rocket science, but it is complex and you have to have the experience. I think more often than not, it's hubris and cultural, that they just think that we're going to do this internally. We don't hire consultants, and we see companies mess up the process over and over again because of pride or because of these cultural issues. And that's one of the reasons why we develop these tools to help companies do it themselves. So at least if they're not going to hire us, hopefully they will subscribe to a technology that at least will help them take them through a methodology that makes sense.
Yeah, and Matt, I would like to see all companies use a professional like Dee and be very diligent about the search or looking at an existing site. But if they find something, if they want to do some of it on their own, Brian kind of sold himself short. They have some phenomenal tools at Terracon. Norfolk Southern Railroad does some neat stuff. Terracon will take data that they've had over the last 60, 70 years, and they've got this way of putting together this executive summary of what you're going to find on that site, from soil conditions, wetlands conditions, potential Native American burial sites and things like that. And they can give you a really good idea of 95% certainty, let's say, of what you're going to find on that site.
At a very competitive price point.
Yeah.
And within a very short time frame. I mean, anybody that's seriously considering a site, if there's not already extensive due diligence on it, you can get a stage 1 report within a very short time period. And the cost point for me is like, I can't believe that it doesn't cost more. It makes a whole lot of sense to do it. I mean, obviously, once you get to the finalist site, you want to do you don't want to do a desktop analysis. You want to, have geotech done specific to your operation. You want to redo the phase 1. You want to make sure that all the wetlands are currently delineated and you have a JD letter from the Corps. So all of that still has to be done, but inspecting the short list, stage 1 is a great tool to be able to do that.
Love
Appreciate that, guys. Going back, Matt, to one of the things that I've seen when I was running projects for state of Tennessee was a lot of direct company, they miss a lot on the workforce side. Like they focus intently on like unemployment rates, not exactly participation rates, what's the population density of a certain community pattern area and all that. And along those lines, and Dee Dee's got a group on her platform called Chimera. Those reports are much more accurate than you're going to get from just trying to sift through your labor statistics data yourself, census data yourself. I mean, talk about time consuming. So there are lots of platforms and data sets that are already put together, and Dee Dee's done a good job of kind of picking all the ones that are most useful and can do it quickly and cost effectively.
Sure.
So like on the stage 1 software we was talking about, it's also really good for communities looking to acquire a piece of property. It gives you that desktop view of, all right, I've got 300 acres here. Why should we buy it? Not just because it's, the mayor's cousin's brother's uncle's farm. But this gives you some kind of third party data to say, okay, let's proceed with this site for land acquisition so we can develop our sites so we can be ready for when those projects come down the road.
Got it. Makes sense.
Just on the point of the difficulty associated with assessing the labor force, and Brian mentioned unemployment rates. I mean, unemployment rate used to actually mean something. Now for me, if you have a 3% unemployment rate and another place has a 6% unemployment rate, it just means that one community has twice as many unemployable people as the other. I mean, everybody that's wants to work, that is capable of working in these types of operations has a job. There's really not anybody particularly in the technical fields, that's sitting on the sidelines that wants to work.
So that workforce availability or workforce factor, what I'm hearing from you guys, it's probably the most important thing, right? But then we've got a lot of companies in the manufacturing space that are switching to more automated processes and maybe reducing that need for available workforce. How does that change the selection criteria? If my goal is to have minimal staffing and maximum automation on my new site, do all those factors like unemployment start to become less relevant? And does it open up my possibilities as far as where I can look?
The numbers go down, so you don't need as big of a workforce, but the skills are more sophisticated with highly automated facilities.
Gotcha.
So we're not talking about somebody that's just turning a wrench now. We're talking about somebody that needs to be able to troubleshoot and has, multi-trade. They've got some mechanical, they've got some electric, they've got, they understand pneumatic. They're challenged with a higher level of thinking at that point.
So I'm still gonna end up looking in the more typical population centers because I'm needing skilled, highly trained labor, not the quantities of maybe the lower skilled labor.
Well, location quotient has a lot to do with it. So if you look at places like the Golden Triangle in Mississippi comes to mind. I mean, in a very small population base, they have a lot of manufacturing. Now you want to be careful about, I have one client that has a facility. I did not put them there. But the location quotient for where they are for manufacturing is 25%. That means 1 in every 4 people works in the manufacturing industry.
Wow.
I mean, that is crazy. Mm-hmm. I mean, who's doing all the other things like healthcare and education and food and beverage, So you can get to a point where you get to some diseconomies of scale. But certainly if you look at that location quotient for either certain industry sectors or certain occupation codes, like, how many welders are in the area? Well, you could have one community that's 50,000 people and it has, a 10%, it has a 10% manufacturing location quotient and a very high number of welders. And that might be better than a community that's twice that size. It has a much lower location quotient for manufacturing.
Gotcha.
And Dee Dee, wouldn't you say too that if you need a lot of engineers and marketing folks and scientists, you're looking at a different quality of life to be able to attract those people and retain them, which might determine where that plant goes?
I think that quality of life is important for everybody. I mean, mechanics like to have a good quality of life as well. And these days they can, the paradigm used to be that communities would recruit companies to come and to their location, and that would create jobs, and therefore people would move there because of the jobs, that they were chasing the opportunity. And now I see the paradigm shifting more to people are choosing where they want to live and they're looking for a job there. And so if you want to be successful as a community, you try to attract people and the companies will follow. And if you're a company that's trying to evaluate where you go, look at where people want to live. And that's not just big cities anymore, or even medium-sized cities. I mean, certainly, COVID has changed some of the dynamic around, where people can live. Obviously for manufacturing and warehouse, you have to be physically located there. But still, lots of ex-urban or rural communities can compete for that type of labor and therefore those types of projects.
That is a fascinating shift. So let me get back to, you had a graphic that you presented, Dee Dee, was kind of upside down, or it was like a funnel basically, right? Now I'm assuming you got hundreds and hundreds of sites going to the top, and then your short list is maybe 2 or 3 until you kind of find that ideal site. I want to check in with these guys because I'm curious from you all's perspective, whether it's structurally, civil, whatever, what is the death knell in your mind? 1 or 2 death knells that would immediately eliminate a site from that funnel. David, I'll start with you.
Well, of course, my focus is maybe different from the other panel members.
Right.
We actually have had a client that was in a site selection process and got it down to 2 sites. Actually had us do a preliminary design on both sites to evaluate the impact of the very different foundation situations. And it wasn't just the foundation system itself, it was all the dewatering, it was all the, wetlands issues, all those kind of things. And that analysis made one of the sites really stand out versus the other. Now that's an unusual circumstance for sure. You don't get the luxury of doing that especially if DD only has 3 weeks to get this done in Europe. But you know, for a building owner who thinks that they have a certain cost per square foot in mind based on conventional shallow foundations, very simple building, and then they end up with a system that's much different than what they expected. It's not just thousands of dollars, it's millions of dollars that can be sunk into the ground. And again, that still may be the best site, but it has to be considered as part of the overall. So certainly, I think Brian mentioned this, you know, you are looking for civil, wetlands, geotechnical issues, all those kind of things. Those databases of prior knowledge of surrounding projects is very helpful. You know, if someone calls me about a foundation system in downtown Nashville, I don't even have to do a geotechnical study. I know what that is. But you know, you go 200 miles outside of the Nashville basin, that starts to change. So that kind of information can be very valuable, and when everything else is equal, it can be a determinator where that project should be located.
Now, I'm not an engineer, David, but I play one on TV, and I am from Nashville. The answer to that is 1 inch of topsoil, 90 feet of limestone, right?
That's right, and it's mighty good limestone too.
That's great. That's good stuff for sure. So, Brian, switching to you, same question, right? You got this funnel that DD showed. What are the death knells from your perspective that would immediately eliminate a site?
So, you know, from the Terracon perspective, obviously it's going to be a lot of the soils, like what's it going to take to mitigate any kind of wetlands? Where's the flood zones? What kind of karst features are on the site? You know, Tim mentioned earlier, I had a client in the past too that we were looking to grade about 800,000 square feet facility, and we ended up having to tier the operating, you know, grade it down, and we ended up saving $4 or $5 million because the original grading cost was about 12 million. You know, so that's a big thing for us. And like on the second side for me too is like what kind of utilities are available there, but also where the utilities are processed, created. If you don't have you may have the right size water lines and everything, but it's got to go somewhere. It's got to come from somewhere. If those facilities are outdated or at capacity, and depending on how long it takes, let's say on a greenfield, it takes to build the facility, if it's going to take us 24 months to increase power, gas, wastewater, I mean, you're probably already out.
Becomes not worth it. Have you seen, just curious, and you may not, but I mean, are there creative solutions you've seen to that utility availability challenge? Have you seen some cool workarounds in your time?
If you're Tennessee at the mega site, you just build a 36-mile pipeline to the Mississippi River. That's pretty creative, expensive, but creative.
How hard is that?
Yeah, that comes to mind. Yeah, the original plan for that was interesting, and let's just say it got a lot of environmental lawyers up in arms about it. So, you know, a lot of the creativity too is solving utility crisis. A lot of times the creativity comes down to how much money you have.
That's
You're either going to get that from a grant from your state, your locals, whatever, or your locals are just going to foot the bill. But yeah, creativity and utility expansions almost is always connected with how much money you can spend or are willing to spend.
Another big one, Matt, is truck traffic and rail traffic. You know, and where it comes from, how I get efficient ingress and egress, how I bring it in safely on the site for both during construction and then for the workers afterwards. Railroad, for example, has some really cool tools that can lay out a facility on the site and show you where the spur is going to come from and where your truck should come in and out. But that's a major consideration, and some sites are just not suitable for it.
Matt, I have a new one.
Yeah, sure.
And I think this is, you know, very interesting for everyone, is that we look at a lot of places that are in a floodplain protected by a levee. So if you think about the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, that's all floodplain protected by a levee. Very high quality levee, never been breached. We've never had a problem getting the facilities insured. It's not in that particular area, but we are looking at another part of the country at a site that is in a floodplain protected by the levee. And the Marsh and AIG just said they won't insure it. So the options were to raise the level out of the floodplain, which was an $80 million price tag, 80, or shift to another part of the industrial park, which was just outside of the floodplain. But then we started getting into liquefaction issues with the soils. So this new thing with the levee, I mean, they're basically taking the FEMA floodplain maps and saying, we are not looking at what FEMA does anymore. These 100-year events are now, 10-year events. These 500-year events are now 20-year events, and we're going to do our own maps. So it's definitely changing the landscape as far as that goes.
You mentioned climate change being one of the factors that's causing it. And that's what I wondered. Are insurers looking at their own data or just kind of almost anecdotal evidence versus relying on this FEMA floodplain maps like they always have? And they are.
You can go to their websites and they have a map that's very rich. You can look at, what they consider to be high risk zones.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. All right, Tim, did you have anything else to add? Just thinking about death knells. That's just always fascinating to me with that one thing, that one characteristic that you just immediately eliminates a site. You said availability of truck and rail traffic. Obviously, that's a huge one. What else have you seen in your time?
Those are the main ones. And I think, we also said it might be possible to bring it in, but what's the timing to get it to the site? Do you need a substation? Do you need 2 feeds from 2 different substations for redundant power? So those would be some major factors.
Clear title.
Yeah.
The site has to be for sale.
And all parcels have to be accounted for.
Right.
So, I mean, ideally, we'd like to have a site that is owned by either, the municipality or the county or by some economic development group, because their incentives are going to be aligned with the projects that we're bringing. But at the very least, if it's owned by a private landowner, then, the community needs to have an option on it, or at least a letter of commitment from that owner that they are willing to sell at this price.
Sure, absolutely. Well, guys, this has been fascinating. Believe it or not, we're already out of time. It's already been an hour. I could keep going, but just has been such an honor. Dee Dee, I want to thank you for joining us. Appreciate you sharing with us. Again, Dee Dee Call, President and Founder of Global Location Strategies. I guess that's why you call it GLS. It's quite a mouthful.
Right. It's easier to say.
David Wright is
like IBM, GLS, just rolls off the tongue.
Rolls off. That's right. David Wright from Bennett Plus, thank you again for joining us. It's a real honor. Brian Farlow from Terracon, it's been a pleasure having you. And Tim Smith from J.E. Dunn, as always. Really appreciate you guys' expertise and input. This session was recorded. If anyone wants to go back and review it, you're going to get a link, I think, that'll allow you to do that. And look forward to part 3 of our industrial webinar series. It's going to be coming up in the next couple of months. And we're going to bring you more good stuff. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate you spending the morning with us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
All right. Bye-bye.